financial crisis has reignited debate over an issue that some say would bring new tax revenue and cut down on crime. What if marijuana and other drugs were legalized? Joining us to talk about this is Jeffrey Miron, senior economics lecturer at Harvard University and author of Drug War Crimes. We go from Yale to Harvard. It's a perfect weekend to do that with the big game this weekend, but we're talking about drugs right now. This is a very, very controversial subject because there's a lot of money involved in saving money, but also in taxation. Am I correct on this?
Well, you're certainly correct. There's a lot of money. My estimates are that if we really legalized all drugs, we could probably improve the overall U.S. budget by $70 to $80 billion. So that's significant. At the same time, given the size of the economy and the size of the deficits we're talking about, it's not going to make a huge difference. There are a lot of other reasons to think about it besides just the budgetary impacts.
It's a lot of money, though. I mean, per your notes, you're saying $77 billion. Can you explain that?
Well, on the one hand, if we legalize it, we're not spending the money on police to arrest people, on prosecutors to try them, on judges, on prisons, and all that sort of stuff. At the same time, if it's legal, we can tax it the way we tax alcohol, cigarettes, and other alleged sins. We can raise a fair bit of revenue from standard taxation, sin taxation, on legalized drugs.
What type of studies? What type of studies have been conducted in terms of how much money it would cost? Not in terms of legal prevention, but in terms of preventing people from getting addicted to drugs, particularly if you expand this beyond marijuana, and also rehab. I mean, like reefer madness. If you imagine that that's what it's going to be like here in this country, have we done studies in that regard to see how much of that $77 billion would be taken up by now having to spend money there?
There's a lot of information on that. The best evidence is that legalization would not lead to a very substantial increase in the use of drugs. It would lead to some, but not a large increase. And most of that increase is going to come from people who are responsible users. The people who already are irresponsible using any of these substances are the ones who are also willing to break the law, so they're already consuming it. We wouldn't be changing that by making it legal. At the same time, there are additional beneficial effects we're likely to get from reduced crime and therefore fewer police for violence and shoplifting and other income-generating crimes. A lot of the people who are going to treatment are being pushed there by the law, not because they actually need treatment. So there are lots of other possible savings beyond what I cited in that $77 billion number. And I don't think that the negative uses of drugs, the irresponsible uses, would change by very much at all under legalization. So we mainly get benefit, not cost.
Well, and I do know, many cancer patients who would welcome the legalization of it for just medicinal reasons, of course. And there's tons of stories out there for that support that. But it just... The notion that it's, we just had a horrific accident. A woman was high. She killed her kids in the car. We hear stories like this. Is this going to just more fatalities, more, as Chris said, rehab, more issues for society that we're having enough trouble with drunk driving, kids underage, smoking, drinking, doing all that? Is this just going to add to it?
I don't think so. First of all, as the example you cited suggests, some of this happens even though it's illegal. Some people ignore the law, and so we get some of these irresponsible uses anyway. I think the people who are being deterred by the law are the responsible users, not the irresponsible users. Secondly, if we're going to have legal alcohol, then it's just utterly inconsistent and bizarre to have illegal marijuana. Now, you might argue, well, we should go back to prohibiting alcohol, but we know that that has huge negative side effects from crime and corruption that we saw in the 1920s and early 30s in the U.S. So consistency demands that those two things be treated similarly. If anything, marijuana is a much more benign substance than alcohol. So we have it backwards.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about what if drugs were legalized, plus what would the U.S. look like if John McCain had won the election. That's a little bit later on. But, Jeffrey, stick with us. We've got a lot more to discuss with you. We'll be right back. Welcome back to our What If special. We're talking to Jeffrey Miron, senior economics lecturer at Harvard University and author of Drug War Crimes, about the legalization of drugs. What can we learn from prohibition days that we could apply, and how much do you think does apply from 80 years ago and prohibiting alcohol to the situation we're in right now with illegal drugs, and particularly marijuana?
I think we learn a couple things. One, we learn that the effect of prohibiting something like marijuana, alcohol, other drugs on the use rates is pretty modest. It's not zero. Certainly we would expect there to be some increase in use if we legalize marijuana, but we shouldn't expect dramatic increases, and the same for other drugs. The second thing we learn is that prohibition is an incredible recipe for crime and corruption. Violence rates soared in the U.S. during alcohol prohibition, and they plummeted again once alcohol prohibition is repealed. Same with corruption of police and judges and prosecutors and so on. So the attempt to sort of prevent people from doing something that a lot of them want to do, okay, and that they can do usually in the privacy away from law enforcement, is just so incredibly impossible, so incredibly difficult, that you have all these ancillary consequences from creating a black market and the incentives that are perverse incentives that are created by that.
Jeff, does this all fall into the category of let's just tax whatever we can because we're desperate right now? Talking fat tax, sugar tax. You know, I hear now that we were just talking the other day, they want to tax college kids for going to school because, well, they get off scot-free. They get to use the town services without paying anything when they come to town. I mean, are we just a desperate society and we're looking for any way we can to scrape two coins together?
There's no question that a lot of people have raised the legalization issue especially strongly right now because they know that there's a lot of interest in collecting some additional tax revenue at the moment. And indeed, one of the reasons that alcohol prohibition was repealed in the early 1930s was because Congress wanted to pass a tax increase to deal with the recession, the incipient depression, of course. We now know that was exactly backwards, but at the time they thought they wanted to raise taxes, and there wasn't much of an income tax at the time, so the main way to get more tax revenue was to tax alcohol. The situation now is that there's so many other sources of tax revenue. Adding marijuana taxation as an example would make some difference, but it would be a pretty small drop in the bucket. And my view is that it's not the main reason. The key reason to legalize is that government shouldn't be interfering with people's individual choices unless it has a compelling reason to do so, unless those people are clearly harming other people by their drug use. And for the most part, that's not the case.
Jeffrey, how realistic is it for us to expect, or to maybe hope, if you're in support of it, that marijuana can be legalized? And then a follow-up to that, how about other drugs, and how far are we going to go? I mean, obviously we're not going to legalize black tar heroin, but how far do we go with that?
Well, I think for marijuana, it may happen in my lifetime. I'm not so confident it's going to happen anytime soon. But if you look at Europe, the laws and the enforcement in Europe are much, much less severe, much less draconian, and indeed they have de facto or almost outright legalization in many aspects of Europe. So that creates a precedent and some evidence that people can look to and realize that all the horror stories from reefer madness did not happen in the places that legalized. Portugal is the best example, which in fact has legalized all drugs, not just marijuana. So I think it's going to happen, but I'm not sure it's going to happen soon. I think we need to look at the evidence a little longer, and Americans need to get used to the idea for a longer period of time.
Well, I tell you, if we keep desperation at its heights, you might see it probably sooner rather than later because we need the money somehow. I just can't help it.
That's true.
The people watching said the same. It harkens back to Cheech and Chong. I gotta say, Jeff, regular on Your Questions, Your Money. We love having you on. Thank you so much. Jeff Miron, senior economics lecturer at Harvard University and author of Drug War Crimes.